Hello ladies and gentlemen and movie lovers of all kind, and welcome back to the channel. As always, I am your host, Brett Murphy, and for today's video, this is going to be my first time trying to take a crack at doing a sort of character analysis styled video. And by that, I mean I'm going to dissect the differences between Vision in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Vision from the comics, comparing them to one another and breaking down each and every single similarity and difference. Vision was first introduced into the Marvel Cinematic Universe back in 2015 during the latter half of Avengers Age of Ultron. For the more casual MCU viewers, he was an exciting new character with godlike abilities that was sure to be a heavy hitter for the Avengers going forward. However, as most hardcore Marvel fans will know, this isn't actually the first appearance of Vision, as the character was first introduced way back in October of 1968 during the Avengers number 57. Though Paul Bettany has been perfect for the role, it seems as though myself, among many other MCU fans, have been fairly disappointed in his appearances so far. With so much promise for a fan-favorite character, what went wrong? And that is the purpose of this video, so without further ado, let's hop right into things. So firstly, we are going to look at the comic book version of the Vision. Now, of course, there have been many iterations of the character, so it is kind of hard to pinpoint exact precise powers, names, locations, blah blah blah, but I feel like I have a pretty fairly set list that has remained consistent for the character throughout his time in the comics. So we are going to be looking at his powers, and the first power that we are going to focus on is his ability to change his density, meaning he can alter his weight from anywhere between 0 pounds to 90 tons, meaning he can go from intangible and can phase through solid objects and even people, which also gives him the ability to travel at lightning-like speeds, or be 90 tons, meaning he can hit with that much force. After that, he can repair himself and has complete awareness and control over his entire anatomy, meaning the dude is aware of every single atom in his body. He can repair himself even after being torn to shreds, which has happened plenty of times throughout his comic book runs, but the most notable time being when She-Hulk literally ripped him in half. With this, he has also learned the ability to replicate himself. And this also likely makes him somewhat immortal because his atoms or cells or whatever can never actually die. They can constantly replicate, he can bring on new ones. So yeah, that effectively makes him immortal to a certain degree. Next is that he can absorb solar energy, because in the comics it is not the Mind Stone on his forehead, but instead it is the solar jewel, which means he can shoot blasts of infrared and microwave radiation from the jewel on his forehead, or in the comics he can also make them come from his eyes like Cyclops or Superman. On top of all this, he also has superhuman intelligence. I mean, the guy is a walking, talking, living supercomputer, with access to almost every bit of knowledge that he might require. He also has superhuman senses, like a heightened sense of smell, sight, and hearing, which, as we know from characters like Wolverine, can definitely come in handy. Oh, and he can also shapeshift. We got a brief taste on that in Infinity War, which we will touch on a bit later. But in the comics, he can shapeshift into just about anyone. And apparently he is also greatly skilled in hand-to-hand combat. This comes from both his superhuman intelligence, which allows him access to any form of martial arts or fighting styles that he would want to learn, but he has also been trained by freaking Captain America. The purpose of this is because if all else fails, if none of his powers can work, he can fall back on those skills. Wink wink, nudge nudge, at Infinity War once again. And lastly is something that isn't often touched on but is also incredibly useful, and that is the fact that Vision is a technopath, meaning that virtually any bit of technology that Vision comes in contact with, be it human or be it alien, he is able to understand it and manipulate it. This can be used for cracking codes, opening doors, flying spaceships, really just about anything. Hold on there for just a quick second. If you're enjoying this video, don't get stuck in the 89% who are currently watching and not subscribed to my channel. If you're enjoying the video, be sure to hit that subscribe button right now in order to find more content just like this. It would be a major help to me and my channel, and I would greatly appreciate it. And while you're at it, don't forget to ring that little bell icon, that way you can be notified about all of my latest uploads. And now, back to the video. And now let's take a brief glimpse at the MCU's version of Vision, which although has some similar powers, they are very much so doled down from his comic book counterpart, and some of them are just completely outright missing. Like I said, some of these powers do carry over, or at least to some degree, but any that do are often drastically altered, as to not make Vision the outright most powerful Avenger, or more powerful than the big baddies they go up against. For starters, like I said earlier, Vision in the MCU has the Mind Stone on his forehead, which gives him life and all of his powers, instead of the Solar Jewel. Which is fairly clever writing, I might add, for it contributes to the overall narrative and structure they were going for with the MCU. Curiously enough though, the Mind Stone doesn't do exactly what the Mind Stone is supposed to do, and that is control minds. Which is really weird to me because we have seen the Mind Stone in action. It was in Loki's scepter throughout all of Avengers, and we saw him control the minds of various big characters. And its only use really seems to be shooting blasts of energy out at people. The next is that he only retains some of his density controlling abilities. Sure, he can fly, and he can go fairly fast, and can phase through walls and people, but oddly enough it seems they use this more so for comedic relief rather than its actual practical capabilities. And there seems to be no sign of superhuman strength mentioned. And now when it comes to repairing himself, it's there, I think. We don't really see it in action, as the only time that he is severely wounded, it completely incapacitates him and renders him basically useless for the rest of the movie. Oh, and he also gets killed. Twice. And that also means there's no signs of him being immortal, I suppose, or replicating himself. The superhuman intelligence is seemingly there, at least a little bit, when the plot requires it to be at the very least. Given that he is part Jarvis and still a supercomputer android, or as he prefers to be called, a synthezoid. He seems to have access to any bit of information that Jarvis could have had access to. The shape-shifting ability is kind of there. I mean, he turns into normal Paul Bettany, but that appears to be the extent of it for the time being. And the hand-to-hand combat skills seem to be non-existent with this iteration of the character because when he doesn't have his powers, he fights for shit. And his techno-speaking abilities are only ever touched on slightly once, when he was able to phase Ultron completely out of the internet, and that's about it. He does have another thing going for him though. He was able to lift Mjolnir with ease, which only a very select few in the MCU have been capable of doing. But there's two main issues with Vision in the MCU, powers aside. Well, I guess powers are still technically included. But we're speaking about them as a whole now and not just comparing potatoes and tomatoes. The main thing is that he didn't get enough time to shine, or possibly fully develop all of these powers. He was born towards the end of Age of Ultron, and he was meant to be Ultron's final form, the god of this new world he was creating, with an Infinity Stone on his forehead and a body made of full vibranium. And granted, he did kick quite a bit of ass during the Battle of Sokovia. And funnily enough, this was actually fairly similar to Vision's original origin story in the comics, where he was created by Ultron to destroy the Avengers, which he easily could have done, but he began to feel human emotion and turned on Ultron. Regardless, when we got to Civil War, the main focus for him was on being a real boy, and falling in love with Wanda. The only instances of seeing him fighting, he is holding back a great deal because these are his friends. Until he accidentally shoots Rodeo to the sky and completely paralyzes him from the waist down. And then Infinity War sees him incapacitated almost immediately and renders him practically useless for the rest of the movie. Oh, and again, he then dies twice. So he doesn't actually get a ton of time to be fleshed out or even figure himself out. Luckily though, we are now 3 episodes deep into WandaVision, so maybe some of these get remedied during the series, or he may possibly even come back after the series in full force into the greater MCU. The other main issue is that he was struck by a severe case of scriptitis, or plot protection or whatever you want to call it. Essentially, it's where the plot needed him weakened, or he would have ripped Thanos a new one. But it's not just him. The same thing happens to almost every other character out there who is way too overpowered in the comics and other forms of media. If you let them be at their full capacity, it would suck all of the tension out of any conflict. There would just be no stakes at all. So although it does make sense, it just sucks because he never got to reach his full potential. Don't get me wrong, I still love the MCU's version of Vision. Paul Bettany is wonderful in the role, and at this point in time, he is the longest running MCU character to a certain degree. Jarvis was there with Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark way back in 2008 during the first Iron Man, and now we are currently in WandaVision. And spoiler alert for whatever reason if you're watching this and don't know, but Tony Stark died back in Endgame. I really do hope that we get to see him shine during this series, and possibly even in the future of the MCU. Such a godlike and iconic character deserves far more time to shine than he got. So that is all for today's video, folks. Be sure to let me know down in the comments if you agree or disagree with my opinions on Vision. And feel free to let me know if you'd like to see other characters get this sort of video analysis breakdown kind of treatment. If you enjoyed that video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And if you'd like to see more content, consider subscribing to my channel and ringing that little bell icon. That way you can be notified about all of my latest uploads. And as always, stay safe. Thank you so much for watching. And that's a wrap. Hey you, yeah you, if you made it this far, just know I appreciate you. And while you're here, consider hitting that subscribe button.